Malaga, the 2nd of August, 1492. All along the Mediterranean coast, the harbors are overwhelmed, as over 100,000 Jews await passage out of the country they once called home. Many of their compatriots are not with them, instead taking their chances by crossing the border into Portugal, but they will not be welcome there for long. Meanwhile, perhaps half of all the Jews on the Iberian Peninsula have chosen their homes over Judaism and accepted baptism. In another port, one such convert, Luis de Torres, awaits his new position as an Arabic translator on the search for a new route to the East Indies. To the surprise of all, his Arabic fluency will not be helpful on that journey. But most numerous amid the crush of refugees are those who have not been able to purchase a ticket. The wealthiest Jews, the former bankers and politicians, have tried to pay for their passage, but there are too many. And yet, more ships are coming. Hundreds of them. Not only are they coming, but they've been sent for the exact purpose of collecting Jews. In city after city, the boarding will last through the night and into the morning, but none will be left behind. The Sephardic age is over. The modern age has just begun. For all the Jews' success on the Iberian Peninsula, violence was never far away. The massacres of 1391 were the confirmation of what the Jewish leadership in Spain had most feared but hoped wasn't true: that the Kingdom of Castile was not exceptional, that their status and wealth would never protect them from the whims of the powers that be. The killings were also the culmination of a long decline, borne about by civil war, demagoguery, and power struggles for which the Jews were easy targets. And as it turned out, that power struggle was just beginning. Back in 1377, Pope Gregory XI had moved the seat of the papacy back to Rome from Avignon. Or had he? Maybe he was just visiting. This is kind of the problem. In either case, Gregory died in Rome, which sans Pope had been in a severe decline for a good 70 years, so after his passing, the city rose up and demanded that the College of Cardinals elect a Roman Pope, Urban VI. But for reasons that don't really matter for our purposes, the cardinals immediately regretted their decision, went back to Avignon, and elected a French pope, Clement VII. So now there were two popes, splitting Catholic Europe in two, and it just kept going like this long after Urban and Clement themselves died. It was the Avignon papacy that was recognized by the crowns of Castile and Aragon, and for most of this period, the Avignon pope was Benedict XIII, a native of Aragon and the foremost voice for suppressing Jewish rights. In 1405, with Benedict's blessing, Castile further restricted commercial activity between Jews and Catholics, outlawed money lending, and voided 50% of outstanding debt. When Jews were massacred in riots the following year, the state responded by forcing the survivors to pay for the damages, and making it illegal for Jews to wear the same clothes as Gentiles. And in 1412, the Archbishop of Burgos, himself a Jewish-born convert, issued 24 laws on behalf of the child King Juan II, severely restricting Jewish employment, personal autonomy, citizenship, and overall quality of life in the hope that they would become destitute enough to choose the same path that he had. Meanwhile in Aragon, Benedict sent his personal physician, another Jewish convert named Jerónimo de Santa Fe, to work with one of the architects of the 1391 massacres, Friar Vicente Ferrer, to put together a disputation that would defeat Judaism once and for all under the crown of Aragon. In 1413, Jerónimo and Ferrer invited Jewish leaders to once again debate the identity of Jesus as the Messiah and the primacy of the Messianic age in Jewish belief at what became known as the Disputation of Tortosa. However, unlike previous disputations, which weren't great to begin with, the Jewish delegation had no legal immunity, faced constant death threats, and were promised arrest and execution for heresy if they even tried to rebut Jerónimo's accusations. In fact, Jerónimo cited the fact that the Jewish delegation was afraid for their lives as proof that Judaism was wrong and weak and pathetic, but also a looming existential threat and that all Jewish writing needed to be burned. Somehow, this show trial managed to go on for months, and at the end, Benedict issued 12 articles forbidding Jewish practice of any kind and forcing Jewish children to receive strictly Catholic educations. This lasted for about a second, because as soon as Jerónimo and Ferrer left the country, the King of Aragon rescinded all of the anti-Jewish laws. Not that it mattered much, because other than Sicily, the Jews of the crown lands of Aragon had been effectively wiped out over the previous 3 decades. But pretty soon after that, the papacy was reunited, Benedict XIII was declared a heretic and excommunicated, all of his rulings against Jews were lifted, and the Jewish population of Iberia pretty quickly rebounded. In fact, by 1475, around 400,000 Jews, almost a third of the world's Jewish population, were living just in Castile, Navarre, and Portugal. That was the same year that King Fernando II of Aragon married Queen Isabel I of Castile, uniting their territories into what would become known as the Spanish Empire. Although Spain itself didn't become a single country for a couple more centuries, the union of the so-called Catholic monarchs did engage in a united foreign policy, which made their respective kingdoms way more powerful and wildly upset the balance of power in Europe. Naturally, this worried a lot of other countries, and as it just so happened, Isabel had married Fernando by breaking her engagement to the King of Portugal, who instead married Isabel's cousin, who arguably had a better claim to the throne, and before you know it, it's a European war. As strange as it might seem, this secular conflict over dynastic succession between two Roman Catholics fundamentally altered religious policy in Spain. Although Fernando and Isabel ended up winning the war with Portugal, they had done so alone. In any future conflict, they would need allies. But the other Western European powers viewed Spain with suspicion, not just because of its power, but also because of its religious demographics. And yes, Jews and Muslims constituted at least 10% of the peninsula's population, but this wasn't exactly about them. There's a reason why so many powerful people, like the Archbishop of Burgos and Jerónimo de Santa Fe, were Jewish-born converts. Over the preceding century, various Spanish rulers had sought to reward Jews and Muslims working in the civil service with lavish promotions in exchange for converting to Christianity. Promotions that had not been offered to their natively Christian colleagues. And just how sincere were these conversions anyway? Maimonides had spoken out against the earlier Jewish tradition of choosing death over forced conversion, and by this time he had been the reigning voice of Jewish law for centuries. As Fernando and Isabel traveled the country during the war with Portugal, priests came to them in one city after the next reporting of converted bureaucrats continuing to practice Judaism behind closed doors. How then could these false converts be prevented from eventually dominating the country, intermingling with the royal houses of Europe, before revealing their true identity and establishing a Jewish superpower to dominate the continent? As silly as it might sound, this was the question posed by the neighboring kingdoms. It was also the question posed by the Dominican friar Tomás de Torquemada, and at his insistence, Fernando and Isabel obtained permission from the Pope to appoint him as Inquisitor General, not of a papal inquisition, but of an independent Spanish Inquisition. Now, I don't want to trivialize the suffering inflicted by Torquemada or his successors, but the Spanish Inquisition might just be the most overhyped institution in European history. The Inquisition lasted until the 19th century, and many of its excesses emerged during the Protestant Reformation, long after the period we're discussing today. And while the early inquisitors were sometimes criticized by the Pope for being overly harsh, they didn't actually catch that many false converts. Suspects had 30 days notice before trials, were presumed innocent until proven guilty, and were usually acquitted. And out and proud Jews and Muslims were explicitly not targeted. Yes, the Spanish Inquisition was bad, but it was not the main show. Far from it. And for that, we must return to a kingdom at war. In all this time, over 2 centuries after the fall of the other taifas, the Kingdom of Granada had hung on, protected by its mountainous terrain, its early adoption of cannons, and easy access to the sea through the port of Malaga. On its own, Castile could never hope to capture the last remaining pocket of Muslim rule. But a united Castile and Aragon certainly could. With the Spanish monarchs financially exhausted by their war with Portugal, the young new Granadine king, Muhammad XII, saw his last chance to maintain a strategic advantage and invaded Castile in 1482. But unbeknownst to Muhammad, the Spanish crown had a secret weapon. Born in Portugal, the Jewish financier Isaac Abarbanel came from a venerable banking family who had fled Castile during the massacres of 1391, and had himself long served in the Portuguese royal court. But after being implicated in a Castilian-backed plot to overthrow the Portuguese king, Isaac fled back to his ancestors' native Toledo just in time to be recruited by Queen Isabel to use his financial wizardry to rebuild the army and stop the Granadine invasion. Yes, the year after the creation of the Inquisition, Isabel had a Jewish finance minister. She also had Jewish handmaidens. I know that sounds crazy, but we have the benefit of hindsight. In 1483, in that moment, more Jews lived in Castile than in any other country, The existing restrictions against Jews were no different from those in any other European country, bar Poland. Nobody was old enough to remember a time when that wasn't the case. And the Inquisition was a project to prove the integrity of Spain's Christian population, not its Jewish one. To people like Abarbanel, all of this was normal. Abarbanel's emergency tax farming worked. Castile successfully raised an army, Muhammad was captured at the Battle of Lucena, and when Muhammad's father seized power and kept fighting the Spaniards, Isabel sent Muhammad to retake the Granadine throne as her vassal. As a condition of Muhammad's restoration, he agreed not to intervene in the Spanish capture of Malaga. Muhammad had assumed that, as Spain's ally, he would get Malaga back after taking power. But that didn't happen. Isabel had not given Muhammad a mandate to be Granada's king. She had afforded him the courtesy of being its last. Over the next 4 years, Spanish forces ate away at all of Granada's major cities until only the eponymous capital remained. However, the monarchs refrained from attacking the city. It was probably the most fortified city in Europe at this point, and Isabel hoped to keep it in its present glory for her arrival. Instead, Muhammad came to negotiate. On the 25th of November, 1491, an agreement was reached. Effective on the 2nd of January 1492, the Kingdom of Granada would cease to exist and its government would be dissolved. The capital would not be plundered, no civilian would be harmed, no war debt would be imposed. Jews and Muslims would be free to worship, and indeed both their religious freedom and their property rights would be respected and enforced by the Crown of Castile. And if they did choose to leave the country, as the former King Muhammad did, Castilian authorities would facilitate their passage to Morocco, no strings attached. As Fernando and Isabel arrived at the Great Alhambra, wearing traditionally Granadine clothing, there was celebration. For the monarchs, all of Iberia was once more under Christian domain. For Jews and Muslims, dignity had been restored. A peaceful transfer of power, giving way to a new Sephardic Golden Age. This new era lasted exactly 88 days. The promises that had been made at Granada were not the Christian triumph envisioned by Grand Inquisitor Torquemada, and after weeks of lobbying, Fernando and Isabel altered the deal. On the 31st of March, still wintering in the Alhambra Palace, the monarchs issued a new edict. All 400,000 Jews under Spanish dominion would be required to convert or leave the country within the next 4 months. Any Jew who remained after the end of July would be executed. All Jewish assets would be seized by the crown, and though officially allowed to keep their property, they would have to sell anything they couldn't carry, and they would have to find and pay for their own passage out of the country. 782 years of Sephardic Jewish history were over. Isaac Abarbanel, who, mind you, was still technically Isabel's finance minister, tried to stop it, offering 30,000 ducats to King Fernando to repeal the decree. But there was no stopping what had begun. Instead, realizing the enormity of what was happening, Abarbanel offered Fernando the 30,000 ducats for one concession: to delay the expulsion by 2 days, from the 31st of July to the 2nd of August. This was Tisha B'Av, the anniversary of the fall of the Jewish temple, and so too the fall of Betar that begat the mass killings by Emperor Hadrian at the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. If Abarbanel couldn't prevent the end of Sephardic Jewry, he could give it a day worthy of its downfall. 4 long, chaotic months later, half of Castile's Jews had submitted to baptism, sure to remain under the watchful eye of the Inquisition. Tens of thousands more fled into Portugal, but that country, like many others, would soon follow Spain's lead and expel them. On the 2nd of August, over 100,000 Jews lined up at the ports along the Spanish coast. The wealthiest of the community, like Abarbanel, had spent all their money buying passage for those who couldn't afford their own. But the rich were few and the poor many. Most of the people waiting at the harbors had not secured their escape, and hoped against hope that a ship, any ship, would take pity and save them. On the morning of the 3rd of August, those ships arrived. The Reconquista had failed. Granada was no longer the last Muslim country in Europe. Over the previous 2 centuries, a new power had risen out of the ashes of the disastrous Fourth Crusade, the Ottomans, to take up the mantle of wealth, power, and knowledge that had once belonged to Al-Andalus, subjugating the scattered remnants of the Roman Empire and, just a few years before the Catholic monarchs' union, wiping it off the map. This was the great European power that would challenge united Spain. Upon learning of the Edict of Expulsion, Sultan Bayezid II dispatched his navy to give the Jews free passage to his domain. Hearing members of court praise the alleged wisdom of King Fernando, the Sultan is said to have remarked to them, "You venture to call Fernando a wise ruler, he who has impoverished his own country and enriched mine." Over the next decade, as many as 150,000 Jewish refugees would resettle in the Ottoman Empire, in Constantinople, Adrianople, Sofia, Sarajevo, and most especially Smyrna and Thessaloniki. Like Yiddish before it, the Spanish spoken by these refugees would not be forgotten, but persist and evolve into Ladino. It is here that the next chapter of Jewish history would be written, ending the age of the Rishonim and beginning the age of the Aharonim. Special thanks to my patrons, including Jeremy Biskind, Osher Gordon, James Majors, Ted Rossini, Corey Ard, Eric Atreides, Matthew Brotman, FC, Lev Ham, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Vicky Nelson, JP Strathausen, Navet Tal, Useful Charts, and Earl Weiss.